Hey everyone, and welcome to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
Best part of my week. Best part of my week. I'm great, man. I feel great, and I'm excited about the pod. And I think our guest today is top drawer. So I can't wait to hear about. This is a topic that we don't talk about enough. I think we're going to talk a little bit about grief today, and it's something I've been waiting to talk about. So yeah, I'm jazzed.
Yeah, so today's guest is our first neuropsychologist of the series. She is a podcast host, the founder of UnBroken, and her name is Dr. Rachel Taylor. She's written and researched and spoken on a range of topics that interface with our lives in a very, very vivid way. And they're uniquely topics that I think we don't talk about enough. So it's an absolute pleasure to have her on. Rachel, how are you?
Oh, I'm really excited to be here and thank you. I didn't know that I was your first neuropsychologist to be on. That feels like a real honour. Thank you for inviting me.
No, well, there's plenty to talk about, starting with, as Mark sort of prefaced, grief. Grief is something that everyone faces inevitably. There's no way around that. We meet at the different ages, and we also meet on the macro. So I think you've spoken about national grief.
Yeah.
But then there's also sort of very personal grief for family members, pets, or times of our life. Do you see grief as one thing or a number of different things?
No, I see it as numerous different nuances, and I think the one thing that we need to remember is that we are all individuals within a system. And I know that the system might not want us to think of ourselves as individuals because then we can sort of package everybody into nice, neat little diagnoses, nice, neat little boxes. But individuals are individuals, and our sort of our DNA and our genetic profile denotes that how we sort of manage ourselves and experience ourselves within the environment actually then denotes how we are going to deal with and manage and cope with everyday occurrences, and that's going to be different for everybody. So yeah, there's no such thing as blanket grief, and this is how it works. It's different for all of us.
Wow, that must make it very challenging to help and to learn how to navigate these waters, because if you can't take a high level abstraction of what grief is and what we can do for grief, then you really have to show up for yourself and figure it out one by one, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think, you can't take a blanket approach, but what I tried to do, and this is, people think this is really trite, but it's not, it's a brain function, is to do everything with kindness. So kindness is about how you work out what you need, not what you want, and have a long-term strategy to underpin that. And kindness is doing it in a way that's not going to shock your system, not going to be too harsh, and actually going to sort of support you in every single process and everything you might, meet in life. And I think that sort of kindness has been hijacked by opportunists and people who are not really that kind. They're actually just exhibitionists, And I think we need to bring it back to, everything that we do, we need to do in kindness. And grief is huge in that.
What's the difference between the kindness generated authentically and the exhibitionist, opportunistic kindness?
Nice.
Well, the exhibitionist kindness is how can you sort of tip up to someone who you don't know and invade their world and presume that you know what they need. Real kindness, authentic kindness, is actually taking time to connect with someone on a human level and have a discussion with them and find out what they need and how you can support and facilitate that. And you have to start with yourself. Kindness needs to start with yourself. If you can't be kind with yourself, then you're not going to be kind to others. It's going to be something else, some other need you're trying to fulfill. And that's not kind.
Yeah. And I'm interested, like, in the context of grief and what grief does to the brain and grief does to the body. Well, then let's start there. What does grief do to the brain? And what does
Exactly. I was about to say, exactly.
Yeah. Well, grief in itself, you have to remember that a human being, your brain has one job, basically. The fundamental job of your brain is to keep you alive. So if your brain is confronted by a scene which, is of loss, whether that's loss of a person, loss of, possession, anything, loss of a limb, it's going to want you to remember that to safeguard against it happening again. So grief fundamentally is a really selfish process because your brain wants to actually flood your system with enough emotion to overlay the memory so that you remember how bad this was. So that is what grief is, actually dealing with that process and the aftermath of it.
The natural follow-on is, how does one deal with grief?
Well, but actually just understanding that depending on what kind of loss you have experienced and also what previous experience you have had with loss, you're going to have a very unique sort of strategies that are happening because of that. So it's you cannot sort of say, well, this is the blanket way of dealing with it. However, one of the main things that we experience when we have any kind of loss is that predominantly the body and the brain will first and foremost go into shock and try to protect us from that loss so that we are not feeling it as acutely until such a time when we have the resources to deal with that. And this is a very interesting concept for me, particularly when you consider such conditions that are bandied about quite a lot, like post-traumatic stress disorder, which basically is it's not a disorder at all. It's like really unkind to call it a disorder, that people who have PTSD have that because their nervous system has had such a shock and not had adequate validation or adequate support, or that shock has been so complex and so far-reaching that they have never had chance to recover from that. And I think this is what we have to sort of gauge, is that when we have something that we are grieving, that we have to sort of measure that in sort of correlation and contrasting with how big was the shock that led to that loss. And there's a difference to that where we engage in accepting that we were going to have a loss. So say we're sort of grieving somebody who maybe has been ill for some time and they've died. Were we accepting of that prior to them dying, or were we still in huge shock that it actually was going to happen? I think sometimes the human body is miraculous and quite cruel, because I've sat through probably about 2 or 3 people and waiting for them to die, and before they die, they seem to pick up. It's like they seem to like have some sort of miracle recovery. You think, oh my God, they're not going to die. They're actually, and they seem to go into some sort of energetic pre-death, and it's sort of, so then when they do die, it is a shock because you're expecting it, they seem to pick up, and then actually they did die. So there was a huge shock with that, and it's how you deal with that. But if somebody's, you've had some loss that you were not expecting, that's going to have a greater level of shock to you than something that you were expecting. So it's all about sort of levels of expectancy and levels of acceptance, I think, that can help to mediate some of the effects of grief and loss on the body and the brain.
Mark, yeah, that seems to correlate with the model of the predictive brain, right? Like, what comes in is interpreted through the lens of what was expected.
Yeah, so, I mean, a big thing that I work on, Rachel, is the way that the brain and the mind might be anticipatory. So they're always expecting it to be one way. And then suffering and pain might be highly correlated with breaks in your expectations. So I've thought a little bit about grief being, you grow up with somebody in your model of how the world works. And when they go missing, at least part of the pain is that you don't know how to orient towards the world without this part of the system acting in the way it is. And then of course that would hurt, because now it's very uncertain. You don't know how it works. So if that's true, what I'd like to know is have you in your work seen, have you done any work with sort of death competencies helping with grief? I mean, learning about death being familiar with the dying process. Is that something that we can be doing? Because it's something theoretically, it feels like the right sort of move. If you understand death, you understand how it goes, then not that you're not going to grieve at all, but you might find a right relationship with your grief or something.
Yeah, I think language is really, really important. And I suppose, from a cognitive perspective, it's very important to, it's all part of the process. And from my perspective, it's really important because we need to get better at talking about death. I mean, we don't even use the word death that often. We have all sorts of synonyms and metaphors and, and if you've got any kind of neurodiversity, this is not going to work for you because metaphors generally don't work for people with neurodiversities. But it's like we try and soften things up without talking about it, as it is. And, if there's one thing that's certain, the brain does like certainty. You're really right. It hates unfamiliarity because it can't predict. It can't predict what's going to happen next. Yeah. The only thing that we can predict is that at some point we are going to die.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we don't like to think of that because, we have an aversion to death because our brain has a survival mechanism. It doesn't like to think about our ultimate demise. But we do need to get better because that is a protective factor.
Yeah, sure it
we
is.
Can sort of take the taboo out of it. And, and it's like, this is probably really morbid, but, I will share with your listeners. I talk about, I've nearly died quite a few times. It's a standing joke with my friends is that, it's like, what's it up to now? 10 or 11? Yeah, 10 or 11 times I've nearly died. And I talk about what kind of death I want, and what kind of autonomy I want over my death and how I want it to be. And there's been just the once where I actually did think to myself, this is it. I could actually die at this point. And then I remember, and at that point, my brain kicked in and I wanted to survive. And I said to the anaesthetist, please make sure I wake up. And he was like, are you anxious? And I was like, yeah, I'm worried this time. And he went, and yet your heart rate is really low. It doesn't show any kind of anxiety whatsoever. And I gave myself a bit of a hypothetical pat on my back. It's the first time I actually equated that keeping fit actually was good for you. It wasn't just aesthetic, So I do talk about death quite a lot. And, I've even thought about having like practices of, going away for an extended period so my family could understand what it might be like for me not to be here and how they will cope. And, I understand that's not for everybody, but it when you talk about the brain wanting predictability, it's like, how do I manage if I take something that's part of my system completely out of my system?
Yeah.
So
it might be one of the effects of going on. So this is a contemplative science podcast. So oftentimes we're thinking about meditation, contemplative training programs in addition to science. Yeah. It might be one of the interesting, Jamie, we haven't really talked about this, but one of the interesting side effects of going on longer term retreats is that you get to learn what's it like to be without my social system. And you learn that you're okay. Like if you go away for 6 months or 3 months or a year, you realize actually I'm okay and I still am happy and there's love in my life and friends and interest and meaning. And your family also gets this time where they go, oh, well, even though they're away, we still have friends and love and interests and problems to solve and life goes on. Actually, that's quite a nice preliminary for some of the inevitable impermanence that we're going to experience in this life. I really like that a lot.
Yeah, well, death as a Buddhist premise is kind of interesting because impermanence, and on top it's like suffering, avoiding the unavoidable, but as Rachel points out, despite all of that, and we know death is coming, we know it's the only guarantee, it's still when you think of grief you think of death, which is weird because we say, well, look, you're grieving things you don't predict. We predict death, but we don't really. There's like two senses.
No, you're like little top agent part might know, oh yeah, I'm going to die a little bit. But all the rest of the system doesn't want this, doesn't expect this at all. There's a wonderful Vedic story where death comes and talks to a hero in one of the Vedic stories. And he says that I was walking around Earth and I can't remember who the hero is who is interviewing him. And he says, well, what was most surprising to you, Death? And Death says, the most surprising thing is that everybody knew about me, but nobody expected me to come to their home. Nobody really thought it was going to happen. That's what I found most surprising. Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose for me as well is that when I think of grief, I don't just think of death either. Grief for me is all sorts of loss. And I've grieved having to accept that I've not had the experience that other people have had, or not had the family network, or the community that is hardwired into us, that we should have a certain experience, especially when we're growing up. And I grieve that I hadn't had that experience, but it took me quite a long time, and I was certainly very adult before I realized that I needed to grieve that. And that was a huge loss process. And for many people, I think, combining that loss with the death of someone, most people are grieving not just a person dying, but the loss of what they thought they were going to have with that person. So this is how convoluted it is. It's impossible to have a grieving process for everybody, because it's so intricate and individual. It's like we have to think about everything.
I have a question here. So you're a neuropsychologist, which means you're a psychologist who's using the brain as the foundation for thinking about psychology. What have you learned, or is there anything surprising that you've learned from the way the brain and the nervous system works in grief and around grief, for how we are best able to deal with or manage or digest or prepare for the grieving process? Have you learned anything surprising about the brain that supported like what to do about these things?
Yeah, that we all know that the brain has a negative bias, but that if you are surrounded by negativity in the form of doom and gloom, fear and anxiety agenda all around you, then your brain is going to respond with a lot more hypervigilance. The amygdala is going to be more enlarged in grief and loss than if you are surrounded with an environment that actually promotes positivity, inclusion, acceptance. And I think there's we've had unfortunately a period in history where people have been forced to grieve in a very unnatural way because of the pandemic. And the problems that people have had because of that, and because of the negativity surrounding them, has actually manifested that most people who lost people or who were grieving during 2020 to 2022 have now got their own nervous system condition because of that. Shows how we need to actually have that sort of inclusive, caring, nurturing, not fear-mongering environment to do our natural human processes. I think people didn't realize how inhuman policies were, and and I'm not going to get political about the rights or the wrongs of it, but they were inhuman, and that had a very human impact in that it made people extremely unwell. And we need to take lessons from that and how we can make things more human in a safer and secure way for people going forward, I think.
Yeah.
What are the misconceptions? Because when people are grieving, quite often what you'll hear them say is, I feel bad for not feeling more sad, or I was okay yesterday, I'm totally fine today. And then, like, what you just read there is like an expectation. There's a lens of, oh, grieving looks like X.
Yeah.
Why is it on the level of, and sort of take your pick here, I'm interested in both, the brain or psychology, that we do tend to grieve in such different ways, and that it tends to come, because it has this texture of waves, right?
Yeah.
Big wave, little smaller wave, big wave, etc.
Yeah. I think you have to look at the social influences, and grief and loss are sort of exhibited in a certain way in films and TV programs, and in books, and in magazines, and stuff like Anybody's Story. So therefore, because we have a mirror neuron system in the brain, so if the mirror neuron system is reading something, watching something, experiencing, it's behaving as if it's happening within your own brain. So if our experience of death and grieving is all cut and dried within 2 hours, then our brain is going to have an expectation that that's how quick the process is. And then we also have, a very strange phenomenon within sort of the death process, is that you somebody dies, and then there is all the practical things to organize a funeral, get them either cremated or put in the ground, and there's a lot of activities, a lot of distraction going on there for the brain. And then there might be specific points in there where you're allowed to feel grief, because there's group grief and stuff like that.
This is mental that we have to do this. Somebody passes in our life, and then we have to do all the bureaucracy of the
it's crazy.
death program without any kind of grieving happen. I mean, that's the time you need to be well and to be in touch, not doing paperwork. It's mental that this happens like this.
Exactly. And it's like you're on this sort of auto pilot, and that's basically what it is. The body goes into autopilot. It's complete distraction. And then after the event, so you've had the big event, and then you might have your group gather in the wake after the event. And then you're expected to get on with normal life. And that expectation is not just from the individual who is grieving, it's the expectation of everybody around. And we are not that great with managing emotion on a group level. I mean, I'm a professional. I don't know whether you call it a talent. What's your talent? Well, could you go, Britain's Got Talent? I'm really good with pain. I can sit next to somebody with their pain and not try to fix them. I'm really comfortable with looking at a human being and acknowledging their pain and not trying to distract them from it, not trying to heal them from it, just saying this is a really normal human experience. I don't think I'd get the golden buzzer for that one, though, would I?
You should. You should get the golden buzzer for that. That's a real talent.
and not many people are comfortable with that, because pain is difficult to see and it's difficult to feel. And remember the mirror neuron system. If I'm in pain and you're seeing it, your brain is also in pain. So we tend to want to try and fix it. So it's like a whole group experience, social influence. It's like grief and death. It's meant to be good done in 2 hours. I'm meant to be okay after the funeral. I'm not meant to show my emotion, because that might make people feel uncomfortable. And if I see emotion, I'm going to have to deal with that because I don't want to feel that pain that other person is feeling. So it's like a whole maelstrom of almost like nonsensical things, because when you see how we live and how we deal with death, you realize just how disconnected to real life we really are. Because we're not wired to be like that. We are wired to be the most social and human and compassionate. We shouldn't deal with pain and suffering as if it's inconsequential. We should deal with pain and suffering and just sit next to it and allow someone to feel it, because that is human.
Whoa, again, this idea that we're disconnected from reality, it again makes me think of like a skillfulness, or like thinking of these things as a talent that you can grow and develop. Because when I think about it, actually, we have very few opportunities to, death in particular. We have lots of opportunities for grief in this life with losing relationships and careers and whatever else. But death in particular, most people, I think, don't get very many opportunities to practice this skill. They get a few early on, and then it happens all in late life. But where do we end up getting? If the mirror neuron system is mimicking what we see, where are we learning about deaf competency? And I guess today it's on TV, which is a very disconnected death process, where you're seeing people be hyperbolous, they're crying, they're all over the place. And that's maybe where we're taking some of our models for what we're supposed to do when we grieve, rather than a more real world, real human.
That's exactly it. And that's, I'm almost like, I say that I talk about inconvenient truths all the time. And an inconvenient truth is that we all have to realize that what we are seeing in sort of a TV programs, films, and to an extent what we're reading and what we're listening to, we have to ask ourselves, is this a true depiction of human experience? And when we do that, we're getting our prefrontal cortex, so the executive functioning, the grown-ups coming into the room, and the grown-up can say, yeah, this is not real. And then we're not overlaying it with emotion the same way. So we're not remembering it. We're not placing meaning on what we are seeing. We're actually bringing the grown up in the room. I spoke about love letter, the prefrontal cortex. I went, please, just everybody start thinking more. It's just like, I never thought in my lifetime I said everybody's just feeling a bit too much. But everybody is. The sort of the emotional intelligence is very low. We have to bring the prefrontal cortex. Is what I'm seeing a true depiction on life? And 99.9%, if you're seeing it on TV, no, it's not. So you need to tell yourself, this isn't true. This is not true. And then you put in a different meaning on it. And then you are actually allowing yourself to explore, then what is true? What is this really like?
Where do we get these deaf competencies? Where can we get more in touch with these things if we are training? I wonder, do you have anything to say on that? Like, where do we go to get good information about dying and death and grief and loss? And I wonder where that is.
Well, you can talk to people and you can ask about their experience. Everybody has an experience of that. But what you can also do, you can actually start exploring, yourself about what is a good death for you. We talk about living the good life all the time, that's like being done to death. Most people don't live a good life, and it's just like, so you should let's just, how would I have a good death? What would that mean? How would I want people to remember that? How can I prepare people? I want to be celebrated. I don't want this to be a huge shock. I want to prepare people that I'm going to die. How do I want you to deal with that? How do I want you to accept it? How do I want you to live? What do I want you to learn from me? And we need to start thinking that, how can our death be a legacy to support other people? That's quite nice. Like, what legacy are you gonna? I'm gonna leave a legacy that I'm gonna ensure that people who love me can carry on afterwards, because I've actually explained to them what my death is going to be and what a good death would be for me.
I love this.
I'm interested, just to take it back 30 seconds. We have this emotional reaction to stimuli, and then we have the think more. So we got the prefrontal cortex, and we can do the top-down thinking.
Yeah.
Is the idea there that, like, selective overlaying of the thinking just can cool down the emotional?
Yeah, absolutely.
And when is a good sign to start doing that? Like, what's the emotional internal calculator that needs to happen for you to go, let's start overlaying?
Well, judging by the state of humanity now, I don't think people need to have that calculator. I think people need to start doing it straight away, because I think that emotional regulation is really important to me, because people mix up emotional regulation with emotional repression. When emotional regulation basically is, I'm feeling an emotion, I can name it, and I can choose how to express that. That's emotional regulation. Even if that's choices, and I'm using myself as this example, I'm going to walk to the other side of the house to get a plastic cup, to walk all the way back so I can throw that plastic cup at a wall, because that's how I want to express how frustrated I feel right now. That is emotional regulation. Emotional repression is, when you're feeling something and you feel like you cannot either identify it or express it for fear of what's going to happen in your environment. Or alternatively, it's a complete explosion, repression or explosion, where you literally say, oh, I've lost control, which is debatable. It is debatable. Not many people do. They're actually choosing to lose control, which is a whole different podcast. So for me, emotional regulation is that you understand what you are feeling, and it's okay. Nobody can tell you how to feel. So sort of going back to something you mentioned before, Jamie, like one day you might feel all right, and the next day you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't feel all right. No one can tell you how you feel and how you should feel. You are a whole biochemical, maelstrom going on that's interacting with your environment. It could be that you're fine, for 3 days, and then suddenly you spot somebody in the street who is wearing a coat that your favorite grandparent used to wear, who you've lost recently. And you were fine until you had, and then the brain, oh my God, is that grandma? And it triggers it. No, it's not, because she's dead. And that is so your brain can remember, your brain is giving you a signal, somebody's lost. What do I need to remember about that? So we can't tell people how to feel, but we can actually say, are you regulated? Can you choose how to express that feeling in a way that you want to? And that's what we need. And if you can't do that, then you need to work on your emotional regulation, which is why you need the grown up in the room coming into it. I will stand by that it was okay to throw that cup.
I like the language of growing up in the room, because it can feel like, in the way that children are reactive, we tend to think, and the difference between growing up and a child is that level of reactivity. But we have both systems running, obviously.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything people can do around their families? Because quite often what happens is, especially with grandparents, you have the grief of the grandparents, and then you have the grief of your parents being as upset as they are, which is something that you don't usually see in most cases.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice practically for how people should navigate potentially difficult family dynamics?
Well, yeah, I think it's to accept that everybody's going to, just as you feel on an individual level, that they're going to feel. And that as long as you are there for them and you are asking them what they need, then there's not much else you pretty much can do. I think some of the discord and upset can happen when you presume what somebody wants, or you presume what somebody's feeling. And you go in and you steamroller in and, oh, this is what we should do. This is what needs to happen next. This is how you're feeling. And one of the worst phrases is, that I can, pretty heinous phrase is, oh, I know how you're feeling. No, you don't. You might be able to have an impression and empathize because it's a similar situation, but you don't know exactly how I'm feeling. So don't presume to do it, because that's really disrespectful. It's just like asking someone, what do you need? And that person, I haven't got a clue what I need. And it's just like, well, I'm here for you when you do. In this situation, I felt like I found that this helped. It might not help you, but and also not being scared to get it wrong. It's like one of the things. It's like, we're human beings, right? We haven't got all the answers. The older I get, the more I realize that the brain is one of the most mystifying. I both love it and hate it in equal measures. The one thing I do know is that it's not your friend. That's the one thing I'm certain of. It's not your friend. But everything else, it's just like, wow, this is amazing. And I think we have to presume that at some level we're going to get it wrong. And it's about intention. Is your intention to support someone and help someone, or is your intention to get things right, or to be seen as a bigger person, or to be seen as a hero, or to be seen as a rescuer? If your intention is, I just want to alleviate your suffering, then you're not going to go far wrong with that.
The two are sort of related, so I want to bring them in. You've spoken about the physiological, psychological, environmental effects of alcohol and with reducing alcohol consumption. What's the relationship between something like grief and the desire to drink and alcoholism? Because there's a very intuitive link we all understand between bad thing happens, escape from difficult emotion. But I was wondering if you could talk about the interface.
Well, obviously, alcohol is the quickest, most legal way of changing your reality. But it also, it cuts off the mechanism between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, so you don't feel the same. You can't register the feeling the same. It depresses your nervous system, so you're not going to feel the pain and the suffering as much. You also have to bring in sort of the social angle of alcohol here, in that people will want to blame the alcohol if, both from the person using it and the person experiencing the person using it, if that person uses alcohol to state some truth bombs or to behave in a certain way. It was like, oh, it was a drink talking, it was a drink behaving. We have a very weird relationship with alcohol in society, and it's like, I don't want to be a killjoy, I really don't. But it doesn't kill neurons like people think. It destroys the synapses between the neurons. So I think that's even worse. It's like, don't just kill it. It kills the ability for the synapses to communicate. And, for somebody who really values a very flexible brain system and works hard at it, just one night of debauched drinking can literally destroy the brain's ability to be open-minded, to be flexible, to even understand the motivation of what you need, and this goes into sort of the reward pathway as well. And alcohol changes the protein expression within the brain system, and once that protein system has been changed, it won't go back to the original state. And that's quite sad. In many ways it's quite sad. And it's a bit of a weird situation, the old alcohol one, because it's so socially acceptable that I almost feel quite cringy and like it's going to get bad reception. What I do in all of my work is I don't tell people how to be, because that's really disrespectful. I like to provide people with explanations of how they work and how they interact with the environment, and then they can choose who they're going to be and how they're going to be. And as long as they own that and take responsibility, I'm fine with that. I'm fine. If you want to listen to everything and still choose to do it, I understand completely. And when you look at sort of how alcohol is used in grieving and loss processes, it's really easy to see why people reach for it, because you would struggle to find any film or any TV program where somebody under stress or pressure or experiencing loss doesn't reach for an alcoholic drink. It's ingrained in our social structure. That's what you do.
And just, can you talk more about the difference between killing synapses and removing the relationship between them? What happens in both cases?
Well, so your synapses are the sort of the gaps between sort of your neurons. So your neuron, if you like, has I'm just realizing we're on a podcast, so people can't see me gesturing with my hands, can they? So the neuron, if you think of it almost like a sort of, it's like a tadpole shape where you've got the head of it, and then it goes the dendrites, which are like the little tail ends of it, and it's where neurons meet. So it's that gap in between the neurons, and that gap is where all the information gets transferred. Now, alcohol gets in those synapses, and it stops the communication between the neurons. So any information, it's difficult to get across, and that's depending on how much alcohol is in the system. Sometimes you get partial blockages and partial destruction, and sometimes it'll be complete if you've got loss. And that people always thought it destroyed the sort of the neurons, so it's like the whole thing. Well, for me, the ability of the neurons to communicate with each other and transmit information is I'm not saying there's a hierarchy of importance between structures and functions in the brain, but the ability to transfer information and that being lost because of something that's preventable seems a bit of a tragic story to me.
There's an interesting parallel between this neurophysiological story and what we've already been talking about, this disconnected information, where we don't know how to grieve because we haven't gotten enough access to good information. The brain struggles to deal with the unpredictability of death and the unpredictability of loss because it doesn't really understand death. It doesn't know how to get a good predictive grip on what it means to lose those things. And here again, we have now another story, which is alcohol produces a state in the brain where you lose information transmission capability, where now you're not getting the kind of information that's accurate about the world. And so there again, we have a disconnect in information. It sort of feels like, we meant to strike out and talk about grief and alcohol, but it really does feel like really we're talking a lot about education here and about getting the right kind of information into the system, and that the system needs good information. And these are the kinds of things that obstruct that.
And it really is. And the little bits that people understand about the brain, it's like distilled into almost pop psychology, and I'm just like, don't bother, because that's really dangerous. It's like so it's like you distill something into like a bite-sized piece that sells magazines or is an easy read in a newspaper, and I look at it and I put my head in my hands and I'm just like, just don't bother.
Do you have one in
Because
particular? Do you have one that you?
you just take it's like anything from how to manage stress, and like you don't manage stress. There is no such thing as bad stress. It's like you have an allostatic load, and anything external to you places pressure on your body systems. It doesn't matter whether you enjoy it or you don't enjoy it. There's just it's
Still a
pressure
load.
and yeah, it's all a load. And people, it's not like, oh, well, just having, one of my pet hates, right? And I'll share this with you. One of my pet hates
Nice.
is so-called life coaches who have been so busy for the past 6 months. I'm taking a well-earned day in the forest and taking a picture of myself and just reminding everybody that you work yourself into the ground for 6 months, take yourself off to a forest for a day, and that's well-being, that's looking after yourself, that's self-care. And it's like, that's not self-care. That's actually indulgence, and that's dangerous practice because you are perpetuating a race to the bottom. But this is what I mean about information being dangerous and used, because then people see that, oh, it's okay to live in a really high-pressured way. And as long as I have a day in the forest once every 6 months, I'm going to thrive from that. And it's like, no, you're not.
Right, because that seems to be an example of like, so what you're saying is short, like that kind of escapism. A day is much less effective.
Yeah, and stress is systemic. You can't just get over it by one little release valve. You need to be changing your morning routines and the way you exercise and what you're eating and the people you're spending time with and the job you have. I mean, that's a systemic change. That's not a go to the forest once a month.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, loss, just a side of grief, loss. We have so much loss in our everyday existence. We lose the ability to be human because of how we live. We lose the ability to be well because of how we live. When you look at it from an evolutionary point of view, a bit of an evolutionary biology here, our body systems are only meant to have 16 hours of hard work a week. And that's typified by sort of, our adrenal glands, tiny glands on top of the kidneys, the smallest glands. They're helped to alleviate stress. You can see from their side, we're not meant to have that much stress. Otherwise, they'd be bigger.
Otherwise, you'd have great big adrenals.
Yeah, exactly. And these are, like I said, I'm like the inconvenient truth teller, and people, either want to hear it or they really don't, because there is no middle ground with some of this. It's like people ask me, how can I biohack my nervous system to get through a really tough time? And I'll go, yeah, I can tell you that, but it's for 3 months max. And then you have to really alleviate everything to recover for 9 months.
Yeah, you'll have to pay that back to your energy bank.
Exactly. And this is, people don't want to hear that. They want to be like superheroes. Look at it. We're surrounded by Marvel universe superheroes. Why can you not do it? Well, you're substandard then, aren't you? And that's the messaging, and it's really dangerous.
Yeah, what's coming through there is the importance of the environmental factors, which is like intuitive on one level, but if you ask something like, well, how do I hack the system? It's maybe not so obvious, right? Because the environmental factors, as Mark points out, it's a little bit more who you're hanging out with, and it's a little bit more what you're doing in the morning.
Yeah, and what you're listening to, and who you're watching, and what your values are, what your integrity is like, and how difficult it is for you to stand against the majority, because even if the majority of human beings are living well, if your information source says everybody's working a 50-hour week, everybody's striving to get this standard of house, this is the aspirational car, and that's what you think is the norm, then you're not going to want to stand against that. It takes a pretty unique kind of person who actually says, well, that's not working for me.
Yeah.
And not many people have the confidence to do that, because you're actually decrying Western civilization, which feels like it's in its dying throes to me as a scientist, but it's still got its tendrils into quite a lot of, pies.
Rachel, where can everybody find you online?
You can only find me on Substack because that's the only ethical platform that I do. So you can find me on Dr. Rachel Taylor on Substack, and I do have the Unbroken podcast, which you'll find on Apple and Spotify. But that you can only find me there. That's it.
Guys, thank you so much for listening. That was Dr. Rachel Taylor. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh no, thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
That was the Contemplative Science podcast. And as always, we will see you next week.